All right. Hello again. One more video for you this week. This time I want to talk about Message to the Grassroots, the speech by Malcolm X that it gave us all to read. I want to get into this and I want to break down some of the differences maybe with Letter from Birmingham Jail and some of the differences just in terms of like method and goal that we can see. Um, Something else that I'm noticing right now, though, and I just did one of the other videos, so maybe that's why I'm thinking of it. But I think it's interesting that this speech is from 1963. Like in the video I did on the Black Arts Movement essay, that essay tried to make it seem like Black arts and like Black nationalism was a response to things that happened in 64 and 65. But Malcolm X was doing this stuff far before then. Even in 63, he's giving this much more radical black nationalist positions. Okay, so in terms of, I want to talk about audience and writing style, just like we did with Birmingham Jail. So first of all, this is called Message to the Grassroots. So who's his audience? It's the grassroots. And it was a speech. So he was just speaking to a bunch of everyday people, right? I think he's in Detroit when he gives this. So, I think that tells us something that like the most famous things that we read from Malcolm X are speeches that he gave like to the public, kind of generally, where there could have been very poor people there, there could have been anybody really. Um, and then for Martin Luther King, uh, letter from Birmingham jail, I would say, is his most famous thing, and it's this letter written to other clergymen, right? Not written to regular people. Um, and we can say, well, it was just a letter that he was writing for a specific purpose, but King, also uses it as a chapter in one of his books, and I think kind of pushed it as being one of his like central, one of the centerpieces of his thinking. Like he could have written a different version of that for his book, where he wrote it more to reach the audience of like the everyday reader or like like a poor black person, like I think Malcolm X has in mind. So yeah, definitely a big difference in their audience here that we can see. And I think this affects the writing style. Like just reading the first sentence here, or the first couple, we want to have of Message to the Grassroots. We want to have just an off-the-cuff chat between you and me, us. We want to talk right down to earth in a language that everybody here can easily understand. So if you compare that to, some of the references that King makes to Socrates or to, Paul and the Corinthians and stuff, like if you're referencing Socrates, you're not trying to speak in language that everyone can understand, the way that Malcolm X is here. So I think we can see that, like, the way that Malcolm X and really black nationalism was more interested, I think, in kind of meeting people where they were, and kind of like meeting the poorest people and connecting with them on that level, not telling them like, oh, you need to go to a workshop and learn how to be self-pure so you can do direct action. They're just like, no, like your life's fucked up and we agree and we want to help change it or something. So yeah, I think we can definitely see the differences in writing style and audience there, as I think kind of linked to the political messages that they ultimately get to. Okay, so I think the first big point that Malcolm X hits on here has to do with unity and the idea of racial solidarity that we talked about with Black nationalism. Um, so just looking at the second paragraph here, he says, "What you and I need to do is learn to forget our differences. When we come together, we don't come together as Baptists or Methodists. You don't catch hell because you're a Baptist. You don't catch hell because you're a Methodist. You don't catch hell because you're a Democrat or a Republican. You don't catch hell because you're a Mason or an Elk. You catch hell because you're a black man. You catch hell. All of us catch hell for the same reason." So and he does this in other speeches too. He does try to set it up like we all have a common oppressor. Um, that like yeah, the way he says it, we all catch hell for the same reason. He's basically saying like whatever divisions black people might have, whether you're a Democrat or Republican or whatever your religion is, the reason that you catch hell or get exploited and oppressed is not because of any of those things. It's primarily because you're black. So I think what he's doing there is again trying to create this sense of solidarity that they need to come together and be united. to get any kind of change. So I think we see that. I think there's a number of ways that the kind of main things about black nationalism that I talked about in that video, I think we see a lot of them show up in this speech. Another thing I wanted to mention, so he talks about this Bandung Conference of 1954, and he describes it as a conference of representatives from countries in Africa and Asia, and basically that they didn't have any European countries, and that it was kind of what he's talking about of like people of color, and here he's including people from Asia and stuff like that. But he's talking about people of color kind of coming together without white people to figure out like what to find ways to be united and connected and to together kind of improve the situation and try to counter their exploitation and stuff and gain more equality. Okay, so I guess we can move on from there. And then I guess we should get to this part. This is maybe the most important few paragraphs here. So he starts talking about the word revolution and what the definition of it is, right? And I think what he's getting into here has a lot to do with what he sees as the goal for the movement, and also the methods that should be used. Now, if you'll remember, in the video on Birmingham jail, I said that, for King, the goal is still negotiation. He says it multiple times. He says, the main goal of direct action of the peaceful protests is to gain a better negotiating position, right? So I want us to have that in the back of our mind as we see what Malcolm X is talking about here. All right, so I'm just going to read a little bit. He says, first, what is a revolution? Sometimes I'm inclined to believe that many people are using the word revolution loosely, without taking careful consideration of what it actually means and what its historical characteristics are. So that's something too, is that he goes to the kind of real history, and we'll see this in the next paragraph where he says, look at the American Revolution in 1776. That revolution was for what? For land. Why did they want land? Independence. How was it carried out? Bloodshed. Number one, it was based on land, the basis of independence, and the only way they could get it was bloodshed. The French Revolution, what was it based on? The landless against the landlord. What was it for? Land. How did they get it? Bloodshed. There was no love lost. There was no compromise. There was no negotiation. I'm telling you, you don't know what a revolution is. The Russian Revolution, what was it based on? Land. The landless against the landlord. How did they bring it about? Bloodshed. You haven't got a revolution that doesn't involve bloodshed. So there's a few things here, all beyond just kind of how striking his writing or speaking style is, and how kind of surprising it might be to see how radical he's being here. But so in terms of goals, right? Because I think that's what he's really trying to talk about here is like, you people are using this word revolution to talk about the civil rights movement and what MLK is doing, but I don't think you know what a revolution is, right? Because he identifies the goal here as what? As land. A revolution's carried out for what? For land. Why did they want land? Independence. So this, I think, goes back to the stuff I was talking about self-direction, right? About having control and like political control for yourselves. So when he's looking at a revolution here, he's saying, if what we really want is independence, if what we really want is control, well, if we look at history, the only way people have gotten that is through bloodshed, is through war, is through rebellion. So I think here's another important point that I think we get from his historical examples here. If we think about how Martin Luther King tried to convince the audience in Letter from Birmingham Jail, what were his strategies to persuade the reader? It was things like I mentioned before, making allusions by saying, what I'm doing now, it's actually what Socrates was doing. It's actually the same as what Paul was doing with the Corinthians. So that is a way of convincing people, that kind of comparison to other, I don't know if you want to say historical figures, other literary figures, maybe. So that's one way he tries to convince people. Another is the kind of metaphors that he uses. I talked about those. I mean, maybe it's more in his speeches that you see that. But these kinds of things of, the storm of injustice is passing and the kind of metaphorical speaking. And then I think another one is just like logic, right? Like if you remember that part where he's like, well, what is a law? Or like, what makes a law just? A law is just when it conforms to the natural order of the world. And if a law doesn't conform to these things, then it's unjust, and that's why it's okay for me to not follow these segregation laws, but follow other laws. You know, it's very logical, that kind of arguing. It's very like, well, if this is the definition of this, well, then here's how that would mean for this. If this, then this. It's very logical in that way. What Malcolm X is doing, it's not any of those things. It's not illusions. It's not metaphors. It's not logic in that kind of way, that kind of abstract logic where you're saying, well, a law is this and that means this. He's using history. So when we talk about the method here, I think Malcolm X is using a more historical method, whereas King relies more on yeah, logic and references and metaphors and stuff. So which one of those things you find more convincing? You know, everyone can have their own preference. I tend to go more towards the historical side and see that as more convincing. And you know, so and then what he says about history here, he's saying is, well, look at other revolutions. Basically saying if you want to think about if African Americans are oppressed and mistreated, right? Um, then how should they go about trying to improve their situation? So to answer this question, what he does is look to the past and he says, well, Americans in 1776 felt that they were oppressed and that they weren't being treated fairly and that they, you know, didn't have equality in the way that they wanted it. They felt like they were being oppressed. So what did they do? They did a revolution. How did they do that? With blood. And what did they want to get? They wanted to get land so that they could have independence, so that they could direct themselves, so that they could have self-direction and political control over themselves. So yeah, that's I think how Malcolm X tries to make this argument is by looking at all these other revolutions and basically saying the only time this stuff has worked has been when people have been willing to fight for it, have been willing to take up arms, you know, for it. Okay, other things here. Goal. So what's his goal here? So again, I know I've said this before, but there's always students who will tell me, you know, well, Martin Luther King and Malcolm X, they both wanted the same thing, right? They both wanted black people to be treated better, and they just went about it differently. And what's his goal here? Does he say his goal is just for black people to be treated better? No, he says his goal is land. His goal is independence. So if we compare that to, again, what Martin Luther King said, which is that the goal is negotiation, right? The goal is to get the people in power to have to give you something because they're afraid of your protests. They're afraid of your boycotts and your sit-ins and your strikes and stuff like that, right? But it's still from the point of view of we need to ask the people in power to do the thing. We need to negotiate with them and compromise with them. Whereas what the goal of what Malcolm X is saying here is we need to take control of land. We need to be able to have our own independent areas that we can control ourselves. And like I said, sometimes they really did mean we should have our own nation, you know, and other times it was more that we need to have our own institutions or be able to control the local governments of these places at least. But these are not the same goals. I truly want to emphasize that. Negotiating and controlling land independently, not the same goals, you know? So you can't really say they had the same goal unless you get so general as to be almost meaningless. And then the method, right? The method for Martin Luther King, we talked about his like 4 steps that he mentions, where it's yeah, determining if injustice exists, trying to negotiate initially, the self-purification, basically getting ready to turn the other cheek and asking yourself if you can accept getting hit without hitting back. And then number 4, the direct action, right? The sit-in, the boycott, the protest, whatever it is, the march. Um, the method here, he says, you know, he says bloodshed, and that's not to say that that's all black nationalists did, that they were just trying to get armies in the street. They did participate in many protests that were nonviolent. That they also had a lot of like community organizing and kind of providing social services to people in specific communities. If you look at, you know, cities like Philadelphia or Newark, New Jersey, or Oakland or Atlanta, a lot of these different places, there were these kind of grassroots networks of all these different organizations. The most famous, like the Black Panthers, but who provided these kind of social things for specifically for like poor black people who lived in these cities. Um, but yeah, he says the only way that people have gotten this kind of independence is through fighting a war. And when you look at the history, I don't know how you can say he's wrong about that. Like that is the history of the situation. Um, right below that, he makes another point that I think is good, and a point that I'd be interested. And I wonder if Martin Luther King ever addressed this, and I'd be interested to hear what he would say to this. But then Malcolm X gives us this whole paragraph saying how um, like people are okay with going to fight in wars in Europe or in Korea, like he says here, to the South Pacific, because I think he's thinking of World War II, he's thinking of the Korean War, and he's thinking of Vietnam when he's talking about this. And he's basically saying, you know, people are willing to go and do violence in that kind of way, right? When you get sent to a war. And this is at a time when there was the draft, right? So it wasn't volunteers, there's people being drafted and sent to war. I'm just going to read some of this, I guess. So Malcolm X says, as long as the white man sent you to Korea, you bled. He sent you to Germany, you bled. He sent you to the South Pacific to fight the Japanese, you bled. You bleed for white people. But when it comes to seeing your own churches being bombed and little black girls being murdered, you haven't got no blood. You bleed when the white man says bleed. You bite when the white man says bite. You bark when the white man says bark. Um, just going on a little bit. How are you going to be nonviolent in Mississippi as violent as you were in Korea? How can you justify being nonviolent in Mississippi and Alabama when your churches are being bombed and your little girls are being murdered? And at the same time, you're going to get violent with Hitler and Tojo and somebody else you don't even know. So that's kind of hard stuff. It's kind of brutal stuff, and that's his style in a lot of ways. It's like just like presenting people with like the brutality of which I think mirrors the brutality that black people were treated with in America, right? But yeah, again, I would love to hear Martin Luther King answer this question because he's basically saying, well, if it was okay to resort to violence to stop the Nazis, right? If that was okay, and I think most people would agree that it was. Like I find it hard to imagine someone would say, well, even though the Nazis were, doing the Holocaust, we should have turned the other cheek, or we should have loved our enemy, or whatever. Um, so yeah, again, I wonder what Martin Luther King would have said to this, because then Malcolm X's point with the comparison is saying, well, if it was correct to be violent with the Nazis because what they were doing was so bad, then how is it not correct to be violent with white people in Mississippi and Alabama? And he's referencing when he's talking about churches here, he's referencing specifically what we talked about the bombing of the church in Birmingham that led to the death of 4 little black girls. And he's basically looking at that and saying like how is it right to go and do violence on behalf of all the Jewish people that Hitler was killing? How is that the right thing? But doing violence on behalf of these 4 little girls being murdered, that's not the right thing. So it's kind of hard to talk about. It's heavy stuff, right? But I would love to hear MLK's response to this and what the argument against this is. Because like Malcolm X goes on to say, he says if violence is wrong in America, it's wrong aboard. If it's wrong to be violent here, then it's wrong to get drafted and fight wars. Um, yeah. So he basically uses that to say, well, this is the same thing, basically. This is the same sort of oppression and evil that needs to be fought. So that if it was right to fight Hitler, it's right to fight, the KKK in the South or something. Um, so just to give us a little more on this idea that I was saying about him, Malcolm X using history as his way of making arguments. He says here, of all our studies, history is the best qualified to reward our research. And when you see that you've got problems, all you have to do is examine the historic method used all over the world by others who have got problems similar to yours. And okay, another thing that I wanted to get at here is the kind of the international way of thinking about these problems. So I was talking about before, he was talking about that conference that included like Asian countries and stuff. Um, I just want to read a little more. So this is with on the idea of like connecting the civil rights movement in America to these kind of worldwide struggles for self-direction, these kind of anti-colonial struggles. So Malcolm X says the Black Revolution is sweeping Asia, sweeping Africa. It's rearing its head in Latin America. The Cuban Revolution, that's a revolution. They overturned the system. How do you think he'll react when you learn what a revolution is? He goes on, a revolution is bloody, a revolution is hostile, a revolution knows no compromise. Oh, this is an interesting one for us. Um, he goes on to say, whoever heard of a revolution where they lock arms, as the Reverend was pointing out beautifully, singing, We Shall Overcome? So he kind of makes fun of the idea of singing We Shall Overcome at a protest, which again, Martin Luther King called that the anthem of the civil rights movement. And Martin Luther King, Malcolm X is kind of making fun of that, saying, well, that's not a revolution. You know, you're not really in this. But again, just I think it's interesting the way that he sees the American civil rights movement as deeply connected to these other like anti-colonial revolutions that are going on in Africa and Asia and Latin America at the time. Okay, so I guess one of the last things I want to talk about is his criticism of Martin Luther King here. We saw the criticisms that MLK had against black nationalism, where he said it was, based on hatred and they've rejected Christianity and all this stuff. So here's Malcolm X's criticism of MLK. Um, he says, and he's talking about the historical thing here. So he says, so I cite these revolutions, brother and sisters, to show you you don't have a peaceful revolution. You don't have a turn the other cheek revolution. There's no such thing as a nonviolent revolution. The only revolution in which the goal is a desegregated lunch counter, a desegregated theater, a desegregated park, and a desegregated public toilet. You can sit down next to white folks on the toilet. That's no revolution. Revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. So yeah, that's the criticism that what you're doing is not how you get equality or independence. That a desegregated lunch counter is so little as to be like laughable. I think to Malcolm X, like I think he views that as so small in the grand scheme of things that he's just not impressed. He's like, this is never going to get you to actual freedom. This is never going to get you to actual independence. Um, yeah, and then he also goes on, and I almost don't even want to really repeat this, but he also goes on he doesn't use MLK's name specifically at this part, but he's talking about like the most famous civil rights leaders, and he basically accuses them all of being quote 20th century Uncle Toms, which is just a scathing criticism. He's basically accusing them of like working on behalf of the United States government and like working against the movement. He basically sees Martin Luther King and these more famous figures as being in it for themselves, being in it for the money, and he thinks that they do more to kind of control and pacify the angry masses of black people than they do to lead them in a productive way. And the last like third of this speech, um, it's just Malcolm X kind of going into details about how the March on Washington like started off as this kind of grassroots radical sort of thing that the government was afraid of, and that what they did to make it to control it basically was they called in Martin Luther King and put him at the head of it. At least the way Malcolm X presents it here, the march started off as kind of a leaderless movement that it was just all these people who were pissed and they were like, we're going to go to Washington, we're going to shut everything down. And that basically the government's response, I don't know how true this is, but it's what he says at least, is that basically President Kennedy like calls in Martin Luther King and is like, you've got to do something to stop this. And he's like, well, I'm not leading it. And he's like, well, we're going to put you at the front. And basically, I guess we can sum it up with Malcolm X says here, talking about Martin Luther King and the other most famous civil rights leaders. He says they controlled you, but they never incited you or excited you. They controlled you, they contained you, they kept you on the plantation. So that's, maybe the strongest possible terms he could denounce them in by saying they kept you on the plantation. So he sees them as, yeah, being like working actively against the movement to kind of like control its more radical impulses and like keep it in line in a very specific thing so it's not too dangerous, right? All right, so I guess that's most of the things here. But the real things I want you guys to take away from this are the differences in goal, right? Where Malcolm X is talking about we need land that we control, and Malcolm X is talking about we need to negotiate with the city governments, and the differences in method. Martin Luther King's like four-step program with direct action, and Malcolm X's bigger focus on like violence and bloodshed and stuff like that. All right, so we'll talk about these things more. I think it would be good to include quotes from this in any essay that you're writing. But remember, we should be using this stuff to help us think about the poems, right? So Malcolm X's ideas are obviously interesting and important, but for us, we should be thinking about how do any of the poems agree or disagree with his politics. All right, so we'll keep thinking about that as we go forward, and I'll talk to you soon.